Joining us now, Arthur Dong is a professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. From Beijing, Keyu Jin is a professor at the London School of Economics and an expert in China's economy. And William Cline is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start in Beijing with Keyu Jin. And Keyu, there's good news coming out of these spring meetings being held here in Washington. That there will be significant growth around the world in the current year. The IMF said last week that it sees Asia as the main engine for global growth, driven in large part by the economies of China, India, and the ASEAN economies. How big and important is Asian growth to the world?
Asian growth is very important, and it's only becoming more important with expansion of countries like China and India. But I think one thing to recognize is that these countries also depend, in turn, really on the growth of the world, as they are very export-dependent still economies. So it is really kind of an interactive kind of model and relationship between Asia and the rest of the world.
So, Bill, we hear the global economy is getting strong and even stronger, but there was also some caution, as we heard from the IMF Asia-Pacific director there, about these tensions that we're seeing between the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China, over trade and tariffs. How big is a challenge that's going to be for the IMF and the World Bank?
Well, the trade tensions are potentially a very serious challenge. I actually read the report a little more nuanced than the big growth. Yes, the 3.9% is higher than the average of 3.5% from 2014 to 2017. But by the end of the period, the forecast period, the U.S. growth is down to 1.4%. And the message that sort of comes through to me is that the U.S. economy is on a sugar high from the fiscal cuts, the tax cuts. The U.S. external deficit is going to widen from 2.5% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP. The most striking number, perhaps, in the whole report is that by 2023, U.S. public debt will be as high as Italy's. So, you know, there's some problems down the road, even if China and the United States are very cordial to each other. I mean, the U.S.-China thing, basically, there is a problem on intellectual property that I think has to be dealt with, the joint ventures and the forced transfer of technology. The challenge is to deal with that in a grown-up way rather than to have a confrontation with high tariffs, and to recognize that the U.S. fiscal is going to be driving our trade balance as much more than specific protection.
Arthur, as we heard Chong Wei tell us there, that the global economic growth faces a lot of challenges in the years ahead. One of the challenges he pointed out, that he singled out, was an aging population. That's a challenge for many economies, China included. How does one counter that? What strategy do you put in place to counter that?
Well, certainly China, and certainly Japan's already in that. China has a rapidly aging population. So with regard to the Chinese economy, they're going to be sort of pivoting in a way as those workers that they have depended on in previous generations start to age out. They cannot be as reliant on both low-cost labor and an ample pool of young people to sort of conduct the manufacturing that they've conducted in years past. And therefore, what we're hearing from China's policymakers is that they wish to advance their economy towards a higher technology economy that embraces innovation and technology rather than being a sort of a workshop for the world.
Keyu, China just released its economic figures for the first quarter. The Chinese economy grew 6.8%. That's better than forecast. But do you think China's going to be able to sustain that type of growth for the rest of the year?
Well, I think it's more a matter of what they choose to do than what they're able to do. My sense is that in the latter half of the year, the government is going to significantly slow down different kinds of investment, including the real estate. And part of the reason is to rein in the local government officials or local governments' extravagant spending according to the central government. So we're likely going to see a decline in investment in all parts of the country And with the real estate, the housing sector also not very active, I think there is a significant chance that the economy will slow down a bit more. Of course, as we know, the government always has the tools and policies to stimulate the economy further if it chooses to do so. But I think in actuality, they are choosing financial stability above everything else.
Arthur, what is your view in that? A decline in investment, what impact will that have?
Well, declining investment in the Chinese economy will certainly, as our colleague has just described, is going to lead to lower amounts of infrastructure spend, lower amounts of spending on shopping malls and building high-rise buildings and things of that sort. That has been a very, very big contributor of jobs in China since 2008, but it certainly came with a lot of debt. And you know, that's certainly been indicated in these IMF meetings. Pretty well understood that China's debt to GDP ratio at this point is about 250% of GDP, which is quite alarming given the rapidity at which that debt was built.
Bill, I'm going to get back to something you mentioned a moment ago, and that is the U.S. budget deficit. You know, at these meetings, the IMF managing director, Christine Lagarde, she praised the United States for the tax reforms that it's implemented, but she also has been encouraging the U.S. to close that budget deficit. How important is that?
You know, there are various voices out of the IMF, and some of the voices sound more alarmist and emphasize that you need to have a buffer in case you need to have a fiscal stimulus down the road because you get back into a recession. I'd say something, though, that is very interesting about this debt problem. You know, the real interest payments that we made in the United States were relative to GDP. They were about 2%. If you take the interest that you actually pay and then you deduct the inflationary erosion of the stock of debt, and that's your real interest, it was actually higher then than it is, certainly than it is now, even though our debt to GDP ratio is quite a bit higher. So you always have to look at both the quantity, which is the debt, and the interest rate. Now, there are a lot of economists out there who worry there's a terrible problem. The world interest rates are so low, secular stagnation. So you can't really worry too much about both the debt and the low interest rates. But I think the U.S. is going to need to make a correction that's going to be politically difficult because the Republicans are going to want to extend the tax cuts, and that's going to make the debt and the deficits larger down the road. So there's work to be done there.
Keyu, as we've heard, there's been a big focus in China on technology and innovation. In fact, the major theme of this year's IMF and World Bank meetings is technology and innovation. They feature very strongly in China's economic growth model. How can China use the resources of the IMF and the World Bank to support its economic aims?
I really think that if one is to be optimistic about the Chinese economy, it is precisely the technological-oriented economy that we're seeing already very vibrant today. And in many parts of the digital economy, especially consumer-driven technologies, it is way ahead of even the frontier in the world. And so one is to be optimistic about that. And of course, the utilization of big data and the government's push or support for this digital economy to thrive, and also the advantage of not having a lot of issues with data regulation, at least for now, will still, spear charge the Chinese technological frontier forward. I think that the world, in terms of the platforms that you mentioned, would be helpful in terms of connecting the Chinese technological companies, with the rest of the world. I do think that what they can offer in terms of both the business model and the very creative aspects of their services could also be beneficial to the rest of the world. But one also has to recognize that the political tension between the two largest economies is going to prevent some of these technological diffusion across borders, and that would be very unfortunate. But still, China's domestic economy is large enough, and we're really seeing a new wave and push of whether it's artificial intelligence or the use of big data and all kinds of various forms of the digital economy really thriving at this point.
Bill, what are your thoughts on how the international community fosters more market competition in this particular sector, the technology sector? Christine Lagarde did say in her address, well, she expressed concern over tech companies and their power, saying that there needs to be more scrutiny because they threaten innovation and productivity.
Well, I think that charge has primarily been levied against the, say, pharmaceutical companies, and it's been an issue in WTO negotiations. It's not clear to me, though, that I think there is an ongoing problem. I don't think you can just ignore the problem of forced transfer of technology by requiring joint ventures. I think to some extent there's an outdated mentality that in the China's case that, well, we're a developing country and therefore we have to have an industrial policy and we can't sort of play by some of the same rules. And I think that's really at the heart of this current standoff with the U.S. Now, you also may be picking up a bit of the sort of European versus American thing. In the United States, we think, gee, Google, et cetera, they're doing great. And the Europeans tend to see, well, they're kind of coming over and taking over our markets. They're not paying taxes. And there's some of that may be going on as well. I do want to mention one thing about the China competitiveness, and that's the exchange rate. One thing that is not true any longer is that China is somehow cheating with its exchange rate.
Right.
That was a problem in 2006 when China's trade surplus got up to 10% of GDP and the U.S. trade deficit got up to 6% of GDP. No longer. China's trade, or more specifically current account balance, is on the order of 1%. The U.S. is 2.5%, 3%. So that aspect of it, at least, doesn't have the same dimension of somehow not playing fair. But I think, yeah, you do have to have technological openness, but you also have to give an incentive to people to invent new stuff.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for. Catch our extensive coverage of the IMF and World Bank spring meetings on air and online at america.com, cgtn.com. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.